Hi everybody, this is Ray, the singing Tallit, and I am continuing reading Alfred Edersheim's The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. Now this is one of those thick books like only PhD students would even care to read. It's about 1,000 pages. The last 120 of which are definitions and a glossary, and then another 120 of that is probably and appendixes related to different subjects that didn't get covered early on. So far, we've been learning about. We haven't even seen Yeshua or Jesus come into play yet. We're still learning about the cultural and philosophical disposition of, let's say disposition of the people that were alive in the Middle East at the time. So let's continue. This chapter is called The Political and Religious Life of the Jewish Dispersion in the West, Their Union in the Great Hope of a Coming Deliverer. So as we've been reading through, we've been seeing a growing story and a growing anticipation of the Messiah. Of course, the 70 weeks had been fulfilled, right? So everyone's expecting a Messiah to appear, and lots of people appeared and claimed to be the Messiah. You may recall in the book of Acts that Gamaliel said such and such person had appeared and said they were Messiah, and fooled many people to come along with him. But in the end, he was not. And by the end of the discussion, when it came to what the disciples were doing, he finally just said, "Well, you know what? If Jehovah's in it, then it'll succeed, and if he's not, then it'll fall apart. So just leave those men alone." That's the wisdom of Gamaliel. All right, chapter 6. It was not only in the capital of the empire that the Jews enjoyed the rights of Roman citizenship. Many in Asia Minor could boast of the same privilege. The Seleucids, rulers of Syria, had previously bestowed kindred privileges on the Jews in many places. Thus, they possessed in some cities twofold rights, the status of both a Roman and the privileges of Asiatic citizenship. Those who enjoyed the former were entitled to a civil government of their own, under archons of their choosing, quite independent of the rule of tribunals of the city in which they lived. As instances, we may mention the Jews of Sardis, Ephesus, Delos, and apparently also of Antioch. But whether legally entitled to it or not, in times of persecution, they probably everywhere claimed the right of self-government and exercised it, except in times of persecution. But as already stated, they also possess, besides this, at least in many places, the privileges of Asiatic citizenship, to the same extent as their heathen fellow citizens. This twofold jurisdiction might have led to serious complications if the archons had not confined their authority strictly to communal interest, without interfering with their ordinary administration of justice, and the Jews willingly submitted to the sentences pronounced by their own tribunals. So, of course, this is part of the tradition of Israel, is to abide by the right rulings of the judges. So apparently, even the Seleucids, who were the family line of Antiochus Epiphanes, allowed the Jews to have some form of self-rule by their own archons. And you'll see that the Hasmonean kings were in a sense this archon rulership. I think the word ethnarch. Ethnarch is the word that they actually use to describe the rulership of the Hasmonean kings over Israel. We all kind of think of the Maccabean revolt as, this big, gigantic, awe-inspiring, crushing victory over the Greeks, but it's more likely that it was a civil war that ended with Greece pulling out and saying, all right, we'll let you self-govern, but you're still paying your taxes, You still owe us tribute, which I'm sure was still paid. But in truth, they enjoyed even more than religious liberty and communal privileges. It was quite in the spirit of the times that potentates friendly to Israel bestowed largesse alike on the temple of Jerusalem and on the synagogues in the provinces. The magnificent porch of the temple was adorned with many such dedicated gifts. Excuse me. Thus we read of repeated costly offerings of the Ptolemies, of a golden wreath which Sais offered after he had taken Jerusalem in conjunction with Herod, and the rich flagons which Augustus and his wife had given to the sanctuary. And although this same emperor praised his grandson for leaving Jerusalem unvisited on his journey from Egypt to Syria, yet he himself made provision for a daily sacrifice on his behalf, which only ceased when the last war against Rome was proclaimed. Even the circumstances that there was a, quote, court of the Gentiles, with marble screen beautifully ornamented, bearing tablets which in Greek and in Latin warned Gentiles not to proceed further, proves that the sanctuary was largely attended by others than Jews, or, in other words, in the words of Josephus, that is, quote, it was held in reverence by the nations to the ends of the earth. So even Augustus Caesar had made sure that an offering was being made for his own grandson daily there at the temple. Now, that's interesting. I had no idea that something like that was going on. But I do know that he was considered a very righteous man in the sense that he, even upon his death, he was given the godhood type of title because he had spent his life being a very humble, thoughtful, and careful man about the way he handled himself in his life. In Syria also, where according to Josephus the largest number of Jews lived, for those who don't know, when it says the Ptolemies were the rulers of Egypt. Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemies, the Greek rulers. In Syria also, where according to Josephus the largest number of Jews lived, and that's from his wars, they experienced special favor. In Antioch, their rights and immunities were recorded on tables of brass. But indeed, the capital of Syria was one of their favorite resorts. It will be remembered what importance attached to it the early history of the Christian church. Antioch was the third city of the empire and lay just outside what the rabbinists designated as Syria, and still regarded it as a holy ground. Thus it formed, so to speak, an advanced post between the Palestinian and the Gentile world. Excuse me. So, if you ever read Alfred Edersheim's work, Sketches of Jewish Social Life, he points out that the rabbis had delineated certain places as being clean and certain places as being unclean. For instance, all of Samaria was unclean. If you walked through Samaria, you were ritually unclean. If you had the dust of Samaria on you, had to be cleansed, washed in a mikveh, and wait for this cleansing period to be over before you were considered cleansed of being in there. That's probably why when Yeshua sent his disciples out 2 by 2, he told them, go to the cities, not to the cities of the Gentiles, but go to our cities and tell our people the Messiah has come. If they accept you, spend time with them. If they don't, knock the dust off your feet and leave. Meaning that he was referring to those cities as being the places that were really unclean, the ones which would not accept that the Messiah had come, because that was already a part of the tradition that was being taught in the synagogues by the rabbis. Excuse me. All right, and they still regarded Syria as this part of Syria, Antioch, as holy ground. So this was still within the realm of what they considered to be the clean land. They considered most everything that David had conquered, literally it was considered clean land all the way from Jerusalem to Babylon, because David at one point had conquered that. So it's no surprise that the big synagogues in Babylon still were considered clean places. In fact, it's written in the Babylonian Talmud that their people were more religious than the people of Jerusalem in terms of their keeping of the rabbinical traditions anyways. So they still regarded this part of Syria, which is Antioch, as a holy ground. Thus it formed, so to speak, an advanced post between Palestine and the Gentile world. Its chief synagogue was a magnificent building to which the successors of Antiochus Epiphanes had given the spoils which that monarch had brought from the temple. The connection between Jerusalem and Antioch was very close. All that occurred in that city was eagerly watched in the Jewish capital. The spread of Christianity there must have excited deep concern. Careful as the Talmud is not to afford unwelcome information which might have led to further mischief, we know that 3 of the principal rabbis went thither on a mission. We could scarcely doubt for the purpose of arresting the progress of Christianity. Again, We find at a later period a record of religious controversy in Antioch between the rabbis and Christians. Yet the Jews of Antioch were strictly Hellenistic, and on one occasion a great rabbi was unable to find among them a copy of even the book of Esther in Hebrew, which accordingly he had to write out from memory for his use in their synagogue. A fit place, this great border city, crowded by Hellenists, in close connection with Jerusalem, to be the birthplace of the name, quote-unquote, Christian, to send forth a Paul on his mission to the Gentile world, and to obtain for it a charter of citizenship far nobler than that which the record was graven on the tablets of brass. But whatever privileges Israel might enjoy, history records an almost continuous series of attempts on the part of the communities among whom they live to deprive them not only of their immunities, but even of their common rights. Foremost among the reasons for this antagonism, we place in the absolute contrariety between heathenism and the synagogue, and the social isolation that Judaism rendered necessary. It was avowedly unlawful for a Jew to even, quote, to keep company or come unto one of another nation. And that's from Acts 10:28. To quarrel with this was to find fault with the law and the religion which made him a Jew. But besides, there was that pride of descent, of creed, of enlightenment, and national privileges, which St. Paul so graphically sums up as, quote, making boast of God and of the law. However differently they might have expressed it, Philo and Hillel would have been at one as to an absolute superiority of the Jew as such. Pretensions of this kind must have been the more provocative. That the populace at any rate envied the prosperity which Jewish industry, talent, and capital everywhere secured. Why should that close, foreign corporation possess every civic right, and yet be free from many of its burdens? Why should their meetings to be expected from the Collegia Illicita? Why should they alone be allowed to export part of the national wealth, to dedicate it to their superstition in Jerusalem? The Jews could not well feign any real interest in what gave its greatness to Ephesus, its attractiveness to Corinth, its influence to Athens. He was already to profit by it, but his inmost thought must have been contempt, and all he wanted was quietness and the protection in his own pursuits. What concern had he with those petty squabbles, ambitions, or designs which agitated the turbulent populace of those Grecian cities? What care he for their popular meetings and their noisy discussions? The recognition of this fact, as Jews, they were strangers in a strange land, made them so loyal to the ruling powers and procured them the protections of kings and Caesars, but it also roused the hatred of the populace. So what he's saying basically is, since the Jews were such a tight-knit social and economic group, they were able to maintain wealth inside their own communities, and they were very interested in staying on very good terms with the ruling powers in the different lands and different cities in which they dwelled. So you see stuff like, we read before, that when Julius Caesar died, the Jews in Rome came out and mourned him publicly that night when they found out about it, singing songs in mourning of Julius Caesar, because he had been a great patron of the Jews and he had allowed them a lot of protections and privileges. Now you see Augustus is doing the same kind of thing. He's allowing them a lot of protections, and the same way in Alexandria. In Alexandria, which we read about earlier, the Sanhedrin there was responsible for making sure that the Egyptian payment of tribute to Rome was paid, because the Egyptian payment was like a quarter of their production of wheat had to be given to Rome, which was enough to feed the whole city for about a quarter of a year. And it was the Jews that were in charge of making sure that that took place. Now this is the same way it was in Europe. Now people will say, oh, the Jews control the banks, and the Jews do this, the Jews do that. It's the same thing that people were saying back then. There's nothing new under the sun. The same anti-Semitism is happening. Because, and this is how it was explained to me by a fantastic political science professor I had in college. He said it's easy to know why the Jews were the people who were running the king's banks in the medieval times? It's because the Jews taught their children how to count and how to read and how to write. That is something that most persons in the ancient world of at least medieval Europe could not do. They could not count, they could not read, and they could not write. The vast majority were illiterate. Only the priesthood usually could read and write, and that was only in Latin. So the Jews have had a long-standing history of educating their children, and that gives them access to people who are in power, because people in power need a trustable, educated mass to work with. Okay? Frankly, for the Jews in Europe, the kings had them in their pocket because, yes, they would get certain privileges as being tax collectors and stuff like that. But at the same time, if the king was to take his hand back of protection off of them, the populace would fall on them and kill them, you know, because the church had them revved up against them, saying, you know, they were Christ killers or whatever. Point is, the same thing was happening back in the old world too. All right, that such should have been the case, and that these widely scattered members have been united in one body is a unique fact in history. Its only true explanation must be sought in a higher divine impulse. The kings which bound them together were a common creed, a common life, a common center, and a common hope. They were all Jews, they all studied the Torah, they were all waiting on the Messiah, and they all knew that the temple was in Jerusalem. Okay? Wherever the Jew sojourned, or however he might differ from his brethren, monotheists, the divine mission of Moses and the authority of the Old Testament were equally to be unquestioned articles of belief. It may well have been that the Hellenistic Jew, living in the midst of a hostile, curious, and scurrilous population, did not care to exhibit over his house and his doorposts at the right of the entrance the mezuzah, which enclosed the folded parchment on 22 lines, bore the words of Deuteronomy 4:4-9, and 11:13-21, or to call attention to their breadth, the tefillin, or the wrappings, the tefillin, the wrappings that you see Jews today still wrapping their arms with the tefillin to put the Word of God on their hands and on their forehead, literally, not in a spiritual sense, but literally strapping it to their bodies as frontlets between their eyes and, of course, upon their hands. Or the phylacteries on his left arm and forehead, or even to make observable the tzitzit, or fringes on the borders of his garments. Perhaps, indeed, all these observances may, at that time, not have been deemed incumbent on every Jew. At any rate, we do not find mention of them in the heathen writers. Similarly, they could easily keep out of view, or they may have had conveniences for their prescribed purifications. But in every place, as we have abundant evidence, where there was at least 10 batlanim, or male householders, and of course that would be a minyan. That's a standard quorum for getting something done. You have to have 10 men. Acts 15:21. 1, and if possible more synagogues. Where there was no synagogue, there was at least a proseuate, which is from Acts 16:13, or a meeting place under the open sky, after the form of a theater, generally outside the town, near a river or the sea, a river of the sea, for the sake of lustrations. These, as we know from classical writers, were well known to the heathens, and even frequented by them. Their Sabbath observance, their fasting on Thursdays, their Day of Atonement, their laws relating to food, their pilgrimages to Jerusalem, all found sympathies among Judaizing Gentiles. They even watched to see how the Sabbath lamp was kindled, and the solemn prayer spoken, which marked the beginning of the Shabbat. But to the Jew, the synagogue was the bond of union throughout the world. There, on the Sabbath and on feast days, they met to read from the same lectionary, the same scripture lessons, which their brethren read throughout the world, and to say, in the words of the same liturgy, their common prayers, catching echoes of the gorgeous temple services in Jerusalem. The heathen must have been struck with awe as they listened, and watched in the gloom of the synagogue the mysterious light at the far curtained end, where the sacred oracles were reverently kept, wrapped in costly coverings. Here the stranger Jew also finds himself at home, the same arrangements as in his own land, and the well-known services and prayers, a hospitable welcome at the Sabbath meal, and in many a home would be pressed on him, and ready aid be proffered in work or trial. So it's sort of like you would expect that Catholic churches would all have exactly the same liturgy go on in them. Sort of like eating at McDonald's. The food always tastes the same. The atmosphere is typically always the same. The menu is always the same. He's using this as a reference to help you understand that Jews who came from anywhere in the ancient world, when they encountered a synagogue in a city and the Jewish population there, they would go to that synagogue, and that they would feel comforted and comfortable because they would be there among their people. They would know the prayers, they would know the liturgy, they would know that anything that they needed would be provided to them by their brethren there. And as I said, you see that this is the Catholic Church. A lot of stuff you see in the Catholic Church is actually a repetition of a lot of the stuff you see in the older first century, Second Temple Jewish practices. They actually took a lot of that stuff and reworked it and made it into what people refer to as Christianity now. We would hope that you could go into any church and you would find your brethren there, and you would, be studying from the same Bible and believe in the same things, and if you had a need, that they would meet it. That's what we would hope for. Unfortunately, there's so many different denominations and different ways of understanding who you're supposed to be as a believer in Yeshua, or a follower of Jesus, or a Christian, or a Seventh-day Adventist, or a Catholic, or a Methodist, or a Mormon, or a et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, or a Baptist, or an Episcopal, or a Church of God, or a Holy Roller, or a evangelistic, et cetera, et cetera. The point he's making was that at this time, with the rabbis, because remember, the Pharisees ran the synagogues, there was a lot of standardization and a lot of ritual that was present there, that if you couldn't go to the temple, you could experience some portion of it there in the synagogue. And most importantly, you could be among the people. Excuse me. For deepest of all conviction was that their common center, strongest of all feelings, was the love which bound them to Palestine and to Jerusalem. Understand, he's calling it Palestine because this book is written in the 1800s. This book is written in the 1880s, when what we call now Israel was still Palestine, still under the rule of the Ottoman Turks. To Jerusalem, the city of God, the joy of all the earth, glory of his people Israel. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. Hellenists and Eastern folks equally realize this. And then when he says that, that's from earlier in the chapters, when he's referring to people, both Jews living west of Jerusalem and Jews living east of Jerusalem. Whether you were over in Alexandria and in that more Greek mindset, or if you were over in Babylon in that very Asiatic mindset, everyone still saw Jerusalem and the temple as the heart of what Judaism was. As the soil of the native land and the deeds of his people, or the graves of his fathers, draw the far-off wanderer to the home of his childhood, or fill the mountaineer in his exile with irrepressible longing for the sounds which the Jew heard in his synagogues, and the observances which he kept. Nor was it with him merely a matter of patriotism, of history, or of association. It was a religious principle, a spiritual hope, no truth more firmly rooted in the consciousness of all than in Jerusalem alone men could truly worship. John 4:20. As Daniel of old had in our hour of worship turned towards the holy city, and his hour of worship turned towards the holy city, so in the synagogue and in his prayers every Jew turned towards Jerusalem, and anything that might imply want or reverence when looking in that direction was considered a grievous sin. From every synagogue in the diaspora, the annual temple tribute was sent up to Jerusalem, no doubt even accompanied by rich votive offerings. few who could undertake or afford the journey, but had in some time or other gone up to the holy city to attend one of the great feasts. Philo, who was held by the same spell as the most bigoted rabbinist, had himself been one of those deputed by his fellow citizens to offer prayers and sacrifices in the great sanctuary. Views and feelings of this kind help us to understand how, on some great feast, as Josephus states on sufficient authority, the population of Jerusalem, with its ecclesiastical boundaries, could have swelled to the enormous number of near 3 millions. Can you imagine this? Where there was no sewer. I mean, the Romans would have built the sewers, and you got to wonder how much human excrement 3 million people in a small area for 1 week make. Of course, they considered the boundaries of Jerusalem to be all the way out to Bethel and Bethany. So there was several miles in all directions where you could actually camp out for the festival and stuff. But still, that is an enormous amount of human excreta in a small place. And you got to remember that if you touch that stuff, it makes you ritually unclean. So you got to wonder how they dealt with that. And still, there was an even stronger bond in their common hope. The hope pointed them all, wherever scattered, back to Palestine. To them, the coming of the Messiah was undoubtedly implied the restoration of Israel's kingdom, and as for the first part in it, the return of the dispersed. Indeed, every devout Jew prayed day by day, "Proclaim by your loud trumpet our deliverance, and raise up a banner to gather our dispersed, and gather us together from the four ends of the earth. Blessed be you, O Yehovah, who gatherest the outcast of your people Israel." That prayer included in its generality also the lost 10 tribes. So, for example, the prophecy of Hosea 11:11 was rendered, quote, "They hasten hither like a bird out of Egypt," referring to Israel and of old, quote, "and like a dove out of the lands of Assyria," referring to the 10 tribes. And thus even these wanderers so long lost were to be reckoned in the field of the Good Shepherd. Now, among people in the, quote, Messianic movement, some people feel that they are a part of these lost 10 tribes, that they are Ephraim, who actually receives the inheritance, who are claiming a right to return to the land, to be there. Of course, this is not necessarily well received by the modern-day Jews who are living in Israel. But this goes to show you that at least at that time, they were of the impression that the lost 10 tribes were lost tribes. Now, if you ask a modern rabbi, he'll tell you that the Assyrian lost tribes were rejoined to Israel in Babylon. Which mystifies me, because why would they be in the first century praying these prayers in the synagogues, calling for the return of the lost 10 tribes, if it had already occurred? So that's something. That's the thing about having a religion that continues to grow and change, is histories can be forgotten and overwritten as you remake them to fit whatever the modern or your current conception of how things should be. Sorry. Woo. Storm front came in and brought plenty of stuffy noses. It is worthwhile to trace how universally and warmly both Eastern and Western Judaism cherish this hope of all Israel's return to their own land. The Targumim bear repeated references to it, and although there may be a question as to the exact date of these paraphrases, it cannot be doubted that in this respect they represented the views of the synagogue at the time of Jesus, or Yeshua. For the same reason, we may gather from the Talmud and in its earliest commentaries that Israel's hope was in regard to the return of the dispersed. It was a beautiful idea to liken Israel to an olive tree, which is never stripped of its leaves. The storm of trial that had swept over it was indeed sent in judgment, but not to destroy, only to purify. Even so, Israel's Persecutions had served to keep them from becoming mixed with the Gentiles. Heaven and earth might be destroyed, but not Israel, and their final deliverance would far outstrip in marvelousness that of the one they had had from Egypt. The winds would blow and bring together the dispersed, nay, if they were but a single Israelite in the land, however distant, he would be restored. With every honor, he would the nations bring them back, the patriarchs, and all the just would rise to share in the joys of the new possession of their land. New hymns as well as the old ones would rise to praise Jehovah. Nay, the bounds of the land would be extended far beyond what they had ever been, and be made as wide as originally promised to Abraham. Nor would that possession ever be taken from them, nor those joys ever be succeeded by sorrows. In view of such general expectations, we cannot fail to mark with what wonderful sobriety the apostles put forth the question to Jesus, quote, "Will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" And that's from Acts 1:6. Hopes and expectations such as these are expressed not only in Talmudic writings. We find them throughout the very interesting apocalyptic class of literature that's called the pseudepigrapha, to which references have already been made. The two earliest of them, the Book of Enoch and then the Sibylline Oracles, are equally emphatic on that subject. The seer in the Book of Enoch beholds Israel in the Messianic time as coming in carriages, and as borne on the wings of the wind from the east, the west, and the south. Fuller details of that happy event are furnished by the Jewish Sibyl. In her utterances, these three events are connected together: the coming of the Messiah, the rebuilding of the temple, and the restoration of the dispersed, when all nations would bring their wealth to the house of God. The latter trait specially reminded us of their Hellenistic origin. A century later, the same joyous confidence, only perhaps more clearly worded, appears to be the so-called Psalter of Solomon. Thus the 17th Psalm burst into its strain: "Blessed are they who shall live in those days, in the reunion of the tribes which God has brought about. And no wonder, since these are the days when," quote, "the king, the son of David," the Psalter of Solomon, 1823, having purged Jerusalem, Psalter of Solomon, 1825, and destroyed the heathen by the word of his mouth, Psalter of Solomon, 1827. This is the kind of work that, this is a highly, this is pseudepigraphal. This is a work that's not in the Bible. This is I guess you'd call it an apocryphal work. But this is something that Jews of the time were very familiar with, just like the Book of Enoch. Even though it may have been written in 300 BC, and certainly not by Enoch, its stories and its lessons are highly evolved into the thinking of the people of the time. And he has destroyed the heathen by the word of his mouth, would gather together a holy people, which he would rule with justice and judge the tribes of his people, dividing them over the land according to tribes, when, quote, "no stranger would any longer dwell among them." So, boo, Psalter of Solomon, because it's basically saying there'd be no more Ger Zadik and no more Ger Toshav. Probably because at the time they didn't acknowledge that there were such a thing anymore. In fact, during the Middle Ages, it was absolutely the opinion of the Rambam and other famous rabbis that the Ger Zadik and the Ger Toshav were gone, and that Israel had no more friends, and that those days were over. However, now I would argue that those days are not over, that they have returned. Another pause, and we reach the time when Yeshua the Messiah appeared. Knowing the characteristics of that time, we scarcely wonder that the Book of Jubilees, which dates from that period, should have been rabbinic in its cast rather than apocalyptic. Yet even there is a reference to the future glory. Thus we are told that though for its wickedness Israel had been scattered, God would gather them all from the midst of the heathen, build among them his sanctuary, and dwell with them. That sanctuary was to be forever and ever, and God would appear to the eye of every one, and every one acknowledge that he was the God of Israel and the father of all of the children of Jacob, and the king upon Mount Zion from everlasting to everlasting. And Zion and Jerusalem shall be holy. When listening to the language of perhaps a contemporary, of Jesus, we can in some measure understand the popular indignation with which such a charge would call forth, as that the man of Nazareth had proposed to destroy the temple. John 2:19, you may recall, he said, I'll tear down and rebuild it. Or that he thought merely of the children of Jacob. There is an ominous pause of a century before we come to the next work of this class, which bears the title, the fourth book of the Esdras. That century had been decisive in the history of Israel. Jesus had lived and died, and his apostles had gone forth to bear the tidings of the new kingdom of God. The church had been founded and separated from the synagogue, and the temple had been destroyed, the holy city laid waste, and Israel undergone sufferings, compared with which the former troubles might also be forgotten. But already the new doctrine had struck its roots deeply into the eastern and into the Hellenistic soils. It were strange indeed, in such circumstances, this book should have been different from any that had preceded it. Stranger still, if earnest Jewish minds had ardent Jewish hearts, had remained wholly unaffected by the new teaching, even though the doctrine of the cross still continued a stumbling block, and the gospel announcement a rock of offense. But perhaps we could scarcely have been prepared to find, as in the fourth book of the Esdras, a doctrinal view which were wholly foreign to Judaism and evidently derived from the New Testament, and which, in logical consistency, would seem to lead up to it. The greater part of the book may be described as a restless tossing, the seer being agitated by the problem and the consequence of sin, which here for the first and only time is presented, as in the New Testament, by the question, why there are so few who are saved, and especially by what to a Jew must have seemed the inscrutable, terrible mystery of Israel's sufferings and banishment. Yet, so far as we can see, no other way of salvation is indicated than that by works and personal righteousness. Throughout there is a tone of deep sadness and intense earnestness. It almost seems sometimes as if one had the wind of a new dispensation sweeping before it, the withered leaves of Israel's autumn. Thus far for the principal portion of the book. The second apocalyptic part endeavors to solve the mystery of Israel's state by foretelling their future. Here also there are echoes of New Testament utterances. What the end is to be, we are told in unmistakable language. His Son, whom the Highest has for a long time preserved to be delivered, the creature by him, is suddenly to appear in the form of a man. From his mouth shall proceed alike woe and fire and storm, which are the tribulations of the last days. And as they shall gather for war against him, he shall stand on Mount Zion, and the holy city shall come down from heaven, prepared and ready, and he shall destroy all his enemies. But a peaceable multitude shall now be gathered to him. These are the 10 tribes who, to separate themselves from the ways of the heathen, had wandered far away, miraculously helped, a journey of 1.5 years, and who were now similarly restored by God to their own land. But as for the, quote, Son, or those who accompanied him, no one on earth would be able to see or know them till the day of his appearing. So this is another work which is not in the King James Bible. This is, I believe the Esdras are in the Catholic Bible, though I don't know if it contains the fourth book. I think the first and second books are in there. Excuse me. It seems scarcely necessary to complete the series of testimony by referring in detail to a book called, quote, The Prophecy and Assumption of Moses, unquote, and to what is known as the Apocalypse of Baruch, the servant of Jeremiah. Both date from probably a somewhat later period than the fourth book of the Esdras, and both are fragmentary. The one distinctly anticipates the return of the 10 tribes, and the other, in the letter to the 9.5 tribes, far beyond the Euphrates, with which the book closes, preserves an ominous silence on that part, or rather alludes to it in language which is so strongly that it reminds us of the adverse opinion expressed in the Talmud, that we cannot help suspecting some internal connection between the two. The writings to which we have referred have all a decidedly Hellenistic tinge, or thought. Still, they are not the outcome of pure Hellenism. It is therefore with peculiar interest that we turn to Philo, the great representative of that direction, to see whether he would admit an idea so purely national, and as it seemed exclusive. Nor are we here left in doubt. So universal was this belief, so deep-seated the conviction, not only in mind but in the heart of Israel, that we could scarcely find it more distinctly expressed than that by the great Alexandrian, referring to Philo. However low the condition of Israel might be, he tells us, or however scattered the people to the ends of the earth, the banished would, on a given sign, be set free in one day. In consistency with his system, he traces this wondrous event to their sudden conversion to virtue, which would make their masters ashamed to hold any longer in bondage those who were so much better than themselves. Then, gathering as by one impulse, the dispersed would return from Hellas, from the lands of the barbarians, from the isles, and from the continents, led by a divine superhuman apparition invisible to others, and visible only to themselves. On their arrival in Palestine, the waste places in the wilderness would be inhabited, and the barren land transformed into fruitfulness. Whatever shades of difference then we may note in the expression of these views, all anticipated the deliverance of Israel, their restoration, and their future preeminent glory. They all connect these events with the coming of the Messiah. This was the promise upon which their, quote, instant service night and day, the 12 tribes, unquote, however grievously oppressed, hope to come, Acts 26:7. To this, quote, sure word of prophecy, unquote, the strangers scattered throughout all lands, they would take heed as unto a light that shines in a dark place, until the day dawned and the day star rose in their hearts, 2 Peter 1:19. It was this which gave meaning to their worship, filled them with patience and suffering, kept them separated from the nations around, and ever fixed their hearts and thoughts upon Jerusalem. For the Jerusalem which was above was the mother of them all. Yet a little while, and he would come, and that he that would come should come, and not tarry, and then all the blessings of glory would be theirs. At any moment the gladsome tidings would burst upon them, that he had come, when their glory would shine from one end of the heavens to the other. All the signs of his advent had come to pass. Perhaps indeed the Messiah might even now be there, ready to manifest himself, so soon as the voice of Israel's repentance called upon him from his hiding. Any hour might be that banner be planted on the top of the mountains, that glittering sword be unsheathed, that trumpet sound. Closer then, and still closer, must be their connection with Jerusalem, as their salvation drew nigh. More earnest their longing, and more eager their gaze, till the dawn of that long-expected day tinged the eastern sky with its brightness. So he's showing us how, at the time that Yeshua appeared, there was a great expectation for a Messiah to appear. And there were many writings that were common among the Jews, the book of Enoch and the Sibylline prophecy stuff, that hinted very much to a very quote-unquote Christian New Testament way of seeing this Messiah who was coming. So it's no surprise that many people became disciples of Yeshua, but many people were also disciples of other men who claimed to be Messiah. I think probably the way we can best decide what is important and what not here is the same way that Gamaliel did. He said, if God is in what these men are doing, it will prosper, and if he is not, it will not. And I must say that Christianity has certainly prospered throughout all the world, though not in the same ways that the Jews had prospered at this time. Um, honestly, had there never been a Bar Kokhba revolt, had there not been such a tendency among the Jews to rebel, at least in Palestine, to rebel against the Roman order, the world would have turned out a very different place. But because there was such a, let's call it, tribalistic view, racist, to use a modern term, view of what the Messiah was, what he was supposed to do, and how he was going to bring about endless glorification of the Jews in general. It kind of makes you wonder how that came about when you read something like the book of Exodus, where when they arrive at Sinai, Jehovah lays down the law and basically says, this is what I expect, this is what I want from my people. And it is what we see in the Ten Commandments. And he makes it clear throughout his law that strangers are welcome to dwell in the land and to become a part of Israel and to not be separated from it. I can't judge a people that lived 2,000 years ago and spoke a different language on a different continent. But I can say that from my own Christian upbringing, the idea of Christianity is one that anyone is welcome, and that you need not be separated from the household of Israel because of your race or your history, your family history, I guess I should say. Unfortunately, there are certain limitations that are stated, but that's way too much to go into right now and to debate. Let's just recap what we had read. We're seeing that in the ancient world, in the Near East and over in around the Mediterranean and places like Alexandria, there is a growing prominence of Greek philosophy in the understanding of Moses. People in the East and Babylon are very resistant to it. People in the West are very accepted to it, and people in Jerusalem have to keep it under their hats if they're interested in studying reason and trying to understand how that fits in with what Moses taught. Because reason is the great gift of the Greeks to the world. And I don't mean science, I mean in the sense of that you can build a systematic way of understanding thoughts and expressions based on one simple principle, which is that A cannot be A and not A simultaneously. That is the foundation of logic. And logic is the big gift of the world. And don't get me wrong, as a philosophy student, there are a group called logical positivists who literally have broken the entire world down into logical symbolism and all decisions and all language and all the things that we think of about humanity. They've broken it down into just symbolic expressions. And it does strip humanity of a lot of the drama that comes along with being alive. And I'm definitely not saying that's the right way to be. But remember that the rabbis, the teachers of this time, are having to come to terms with the effect that learning about reason is having on a population of people who have spent their entire lives indoctrinating themselves into what is taught to them at the synagogue. And I mean, let's face it, they were a lot more unified a people than any Christian group has ever been. Yeah, but in that, and it's very similar to that today. Trust me, if you meet Jews, Jews are going to side with Jews. That's pretty much it. Jews help Jews. Even Jews who are Reformed Jews still identify them, even though they have nothing to do. They don't study the Torah. They don't necessarily keep the feast. They may keep the ones they like. Heck, they may do Christmas and eat Christmas ham. But they still refer to themselves as Jews, and they might disagree with the practices of other Jews, but they still identify other Jews as Jews as well. They don't simply say, oh, well, I'm just some white person in America. No, they'll say, I'm a Jew. They don't say, oh, I'm just some Spanish person. They say, no, I'm a Jew. I'm Sephardic Jew, or I'm an Ashkenazi Jew. They're not going to say to you, oh, I'm just some person. My family history don't matter. No, it does matter. And for some reason, and he's, even at the time that we're reading about, even when Jews tried to completely indoctrinate themselves into the customs of the Hellenistic land where they were still labeled as Jews. They could not escape that moniker of Jew. You are a Jew. And we have the same thing going today. And I wonder if it's self-imposed or if it's a part of God's plan, because he's literally making sure that we all know, too. Not simply that they know, but that we know. And I guess I just don't know. And I find the more that I learn, the less I know. Like, for instance, this fourth book of Esdras, I have never read that. I didn't even know that existed. These Sibylline prophecies, I don't know anything about them. I've read some of the book of Enoch, but it's only because it said that there were giants, and I wanted to see if there really were fossils of giants out there to see if it really was true or not. All in all, sometimes I'm left with more questions than I get answers. And what I see is people growing and changing and separating themselves out, which is exactly what Pharisee means, by the way. It means the separated ones. They separate out. The Pharisees, they are separated from the other people. And they would tell you, just as we read earlier, that you are not, well, earlier in here it says you're not even to associate with the Gentile, basically. That's Pharisaic teaching. So the Pharisees say to you, you can't even sit at a table and eat with those filthy Gentiles, or they will make you unclean by their uncleanness, right? And if you're unclean, then you can't go into the synagogue. It's not just that you can't go to the temple because they consider the synagogue so holy a place, they wouldn't allow you into the synagogue. So if you were someone who had been in the presence and company of Gentiles, then you were considered unclean and filthy. This is, of course, why when Peter was eating with the Jews of the circumcision, which is the Pharisees, Paul came in there and raised Cain about it. And he says, well, if you're going to be a Jew, go be a Jew. If you're going to be what we are now, you need to be what we are now. Because Pharisaism and getting Gentiles into the fellowship of being a part of the house of Israel doesn't work together. Now, there may have been some Pharisees and teachers who were like, oh, it'll work. You just need to circumcise them and then send them to the synagogue, have them properly cleansed and teach them in the synagogue. It can work. We'll turn them into more Pharisees. Unfortunately, that wasn't necessarily what people like Paul and Peter felt was appropriate at the time, even though I'm sure that Paul was teaching the Torah to many of the Gentile churches that he had established. For instance, in 1 Corinthians, you see him chastising the entire church, telling them they need to get the man out of the church who has his father's wife. And you got to wonder, well, what's the big deal about having your father's wife? Well, I mean, what if is she his mother-in-law? Is his father dead? Is his mother-in-law like really hot and young and actually his age? And his dad had married a much younger woman, and then he passed away, and now she's a widow. And he's like, well, it's not. She was never really my mom. I was already, out the house and grown with my own family when he even married her, and then my wife passed away, and then you're like, well, there could be all these mitigating circumstances. And Paul's just like, no, get him out. Why? Because in the Torah it says a man may not have his father's wife. Period. Done. Doesn't matter. No mediating circumstances. You just can't do it. So don't do it. This is the kind of things that we have to think about when reading the scriptures. Anyways, it's Eve of Passover today, and all the chametz is out of the house, and we're going to start unleavened bread and get to spend some time with some friends here who are also believers, and probably spend time debating every jot and tittle that we come across. Maybe I'll get a chance to read the Mishnah and read the Sibylline prophecies. See what these things are that were affecting the mindset of the Jews at the time. of Christ. So in the meantime, shalom, be blessed, and thank you for joining me on this reading of Alfred Edersheim's The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. A very long and technical book. Let me show. I'll show you. This is an average page. So here's just an average page. This is the part I was actually reading. Here are all the citations and references that he has included to make sure you know he's not just making this up. I mean, this is a seriously scholarly work. This is a man who has devoted his life and times to the life and times of Jesus. And I'm very thankful for this gentleman who was born an Orthodox Jew, and then later in his life, his family converted. I think he was 8 when his family converted, and then he became one of the world's leading scholars on Judaism at the time, as an Anglican priest. Still a Jew, but is an Anglican priest. So, he had some access still. So anyways, be blessed and keep on trucking.